Layered with sights unseen and grief yet to pass, the scream forced its way through the seams in the white wall, widening the cracks in the mortar until it found my unwilling ear. Again. I heard the crunching sound. The tearing and the screams jolted every atom in my body. My God. The screams, they tore a hole in my mind. The knotted pit in my belly expanded as the strange figure emerged from darkness, ran through the corridor with a crazed look in his eyes and panicked prance in his flight, only to give out in front of me. I was slow to move. Any steps taken in the moment were mindless, inspired by the single urge that pushed my body forward. To survive. Staring at me was half a face. Why did they seem so strange, yet so familiar? I knew once I got to the eyes. I knew him. I had seen them for an eternity, and I knew them well. His face had been intact, his body once whole. Not anymore. He lay on the singeing floor, bearing half a face and two bloody stumps where arms once went. I did it again. We were talking about the scream. The screaming continued like an unrelenting canine set on getting its owner's attention. I refused at first, tossing, turning, attempting to dampen the sound with a pillow, until I couldn't anymore. I woke. Living with a neighbor tormented by feverish nightmares was something I had gotten used to and somehow constantly needed to acclimatize to. I was awake now. Awake as I could be, after being forcefully ejected from sleep's embrace, that is. With puffy eyes, unable to differentiate between geometrical shapes, I stumbled out of the stone-cut bed and groped my way to the kitchenette by the side. With flailing hands, I felt my way around until they touched a cylindrical object that, in time, went under the faucet-shaped stump. The silence at the scream's trough was punctuated by a sloshing sound as the water made it into the cup and, after that, my throat. After my thirst was quenched, I ambled back to the bed and caught a glimpse at my alarm clock. 7:59, before laying down on the stiff foam. I wasn't thirsty anymore. Lucas had finally stopped screaming. All was right with the world, I said to myself as I closed my eyes to walk back into sleep's embrace. Shit. It wasn't meant to be. The memory of the Esther flooded my mind as I sprung up to a sitting position. I whisked the alarm clock from the makeshift stool, shook my eyes, and peered through the misty fog of sleep that clouded my gaze. I looked at it, and looking back at me were the broken and dotted lines of the segmented clock. 9 a.m. Shit. Making an unpleasant sound that was a cross between a growl and a sigh, I leaped up and allowed my feet to take me away from the bed. The shower was brief. All showers were quick in this apartment. Every surface in the bathroom was covered in dirt, making it hard to decide what was what. The dirt-brown porcelain tub had lost any trace of its original color. It was a sight that fostered uneasiness. Where was I? Yes. My bath was a quick one. It wasn't really one in retrospect. A bath, that is. But it was enough to wash away whatever odor I dragged home the day before. Done with the shower, I rechecked the clock. The hour was halfway from turning double digits. I put on my clothes, grabbed my jacket, sped through the door, and past the dysfunctional elevator. I burst out of the building and into the car, not before unhooking my jacket, which had been caught by a stray rusty metal on the side of the door. It took 2 forceful yanks before the car door obliged my request to close. Shortly after that, I began driving to the NASA compound. At least, I would have begun if the road in front of me wasn't a stockpot of cars. Living in this part of town was a nightmare, and it would probably get even more nightmarish due to the new construction. A neighbor for an alarm clock. A road that was never traffic-free. Why didn't I leave? Why didn't I move, you might ask? I had no choice. One word, 5 letters. Money. Coming out on the other side of the stew took a steaming amount of time, but after I did, I steered my car into the fast lane and continued my path to the compound. I worked at the Paladin paper, and working there, I was told, was an achievement rivaled by none. Writing for the Paladin was envy-inspiring. The journalists there were the frontline defense against issues that plagued society. In the words of the editor-in-chief, the Paladin was the, she emphasized the, apothecary that proffered remedy to society's ills. In retrospect, the metaphor had been apt. The paper had once been held as a gold standard, but apothecaries had long been phased out. Although I'd been at the Paladin for 4 years, I offered notice. I couldn't do all that work for peanuts anymore. Not that there was anything anyone could do to help it, as everyone in the paper earned peanuts too. I didn't want to be an apothecary anymore. I wanted to be a doctor. Or was that a pharmacist or a I can't remember. According to Lori, the good people at NASA who deemed it fit to interrupt what had been meant to be my time of rest had invited the press to cover what they termed the greatest invention. The paper had no one to represent, as everyone had a beat they were chasing. "You have to go," she said. Why does this have to be so far? I remembered thinking. Would it have killed them to bring the compound any closer and not put it in the middle of nowhere? My feet slammed on the throttle to get there faster. It took 2 stops and 2 half-filled tanks to get me there. I'd just gotten into the building's range of view, just enough to see the tip, when I began to wonder how I would make it back home, as the last gas station was miles away. A lot of miles away. I doubted I had enough money to cover it. My thoughts about the logistics of my journey didn't last long as I drove into full view of the compound. My jawbone did a lousy job keeping my mouth closed. The compound spanned a great width and an even greater height. What was going on in there? I shook these thoughts off and drove my sorry excuse for a car forward until I got to the entrance marked off by a gate pressed into the seemingly unending wall and a security booth in front of said gate. I eased my car to a halt, stopping next to the booth on the right-hand side. The security man looked at me with scrutinizing eyes. Before I could get a word out, he asked me for identification and my aim here. "Name's Aaron Wallace. I'm with Paladin," I replied even as my hands undid the little strap that held the glove compartment shut. A poof of dust from the clutter within assaulted me as I eyeballed the mess for my ID and dug through it. For a second, the thought that my ID was back home made my skin jump. I found it hanging in the corner of the compartment. I muttered something inaudible before handing it to the uniformed guard who had been looking at me in a way that suggested he would probably throw me off the compound if I hadn't provided adequate identification. He stared at the card and back and pointed out the direction my car was meant to be parked. "Have a good day," I responded as I drove through the now raised barricade. I drove for what felt like another mile before I came into the compound proper. I pulled into the parking lot. When did NASA have a military outfit? Did the ritual with the door, and rushed off until I reached the meeting point. There was a man in the forecenter of the crowd saying something. I can't remember now if I hadn't been paying attention or if it was because of the distance between us. Whatever it was, I couldn't hear what he was saying. He looked very passionate about it, though. It wasn't long before the man began talking about the nature of the compound and the tour leading to the main reason we were here.
Welcome to the NASA compound. This,
He pointed to the multi-level building behind him,
holds the future.
"Why are we here?" asked someone from behind. "Is it because of the new telescope that was launched? Is something wrong with it?"
Not at all.
The man sounded hurt at the notion that the agency could build a faulty product. Almost on a dime, he laughed it away, turned, and waved at us to follow. Why, Loris? Why did it have to be NASA? Why did it have to be about science stuff? I contemplated my fortune. I was about to begin moving when someone tapped my shoulder. I turned around and looked. God, why did it have to be him of all people? Someone was fucking with me, for sure. Not very much surprised me. I'd covered crimes and war before, but this was no war. This was slaughter. He couldn't hear me. I could tell by the bloodshot expression in his eyes. There was something about them, his wide-eyed gaze that signaled his absence. It was the same look I wore on my face, even as the sound of my beating heart distorted every other noise. His mind was lost in pain. Mine would follow shortly. He wasn't in this state for long. He dragged me closer with his eyes and whispered into my ear before letting the pain sweep him away from this plane of existence. What the fuck is going on here?
Come along, people,
the tour guide instructed.
I'm sure we are all excited to see the next generation of inventions the agency is about to roll out.
God, I thought, as I began walking with the rest.
It's been a long time since we saw each other, Aaron. What are you doing here?
Chad asked. Chad wasn't a bad person. It was just that he was always at a 10 when he needed to be a level lower. Too excited, and too often for generally any sane person. Chad and I used to work at the Paladin some years back. That is, until he left the struggling paper to work on his blog. Again, the apothecary being dropped for the pharmacist. I drowned a sigh before answering the question and pointing out the badge he was wearing around his neck, just like everyone else. I suspect the same thing you're doing here, I replied.
Oh, he exclaimed as if it had magically appeared. Excited to see you. When was the last time we saw each other?
Chad asked. I don't know. I lied. Offering up anything in response to Chad's question was a prompt that would lead him to an endless discussion on everything and anything. It seemed silence had the same effect too, because he continued.
Small world,
he exclaimed before tapping me on my shoulder. I agreed. Anything else was lighting the fuse of a bomb that could go off even before it was fully lit. I tried to walk away from Chad's reach, but no matter what I did, he stuck close. Did you hear that? I asked him even as I turned around to look at the 5th level of the building. Chad hadn't heard it. Everyone else seemed oblivious to it. It was probably nothing, I replied to his excited question of,
"What was that?"
"What is this invention?" I whispered. If I could get a clue of what it was, maybe I could leave before the tour was over. I could make up something and kick up to Lori to fulfill my part in this assignment she forced on me. But even as I contemplated the option, I knew no such thing could happen. We were barely on the 6th floor when Chad stopped me in my tracks by way of shoving his hand to my chest and pointing to the side with the other.
"We don't want to end up like them,"
he said, holding one hand to cover his mouth and the other pointing at the body by the side of the wall. It had been slashed into two, with the contents of its torso spewing out across the hallway. He was halfway into telling me he wasn't leaving when he hurled out the contents of his stomach. If there was anything left, that is. "Now!" I shouted, even as the screech pulsed through the hall one more time. "Anything can set it off. Anything can set it off. Need to be careful," I whispered. There was no need to tell him that I had a bad feeling about this. It was more or less everything that was on our minds. "Wait," Chad said. "Isn't that your ex?" "What are you talking about?" I questioned as I followed the direction of his pointing figure only to see her. Just my luck, I thought. Just my luck. My lamentation was undercut by the sound of the tour guide and a sight that gave me pause. Did those people just walk out of the wall? No, they couldn't have. Caught between trying to figure out why my ex was here and if my mind was slowly losing it, I only heard a few of the guide's briefs on the miniature Hubble telescope and how expensive it was. The thought was still churning in my mind when I spoke without knowing I had. "What happens through that door?" A brief laugh underscored how obvious he believed the answer to my question was. "It's just a wall," he replied as he tried to shuttle us to the next wonder the building held. With my eyes still trained on the wall, I followed the group. The memory was about to fade when I saw a crack in the wall, followed by another person stepping out of it. That wasn't a wall. With my head down, I scrambled away from the group and headed for the wall, the door. Fortunately, no one had seen me swipe the card off the wall's latest production. With a quick and random flailing of the card in front of the wall, it opened up and revealed what I'd come to know. It wasn't just a wall. I stepped in and scrutinized the inside. Midway into turning, I jerked back from the sight I saw. Chad was staring at me. "Get in here before someone notices you." The wall closed after he made it in. The walls of the spaces formed an enclosure only a few feet wide. I scanned the room with my eyes. Was it a storage room? It took me only a second after the initial thought to realize that we were in an elevator. The small room was graded with a texture that lent it a futuristic look while still aging beyond the century we were in. After realizing it was an elevator, I searched for a control panel. There weren't any interfaces, screens, or buttons, at least not any I could see. Everything was one endless sheet, like a mirror that had lost its reflectiveness. Fucking pretentious, I thought to myself as I searched for a slot to scan the stolen ID card in my possession. At least they got rid of the annoying music, if it could be called that. From the corner of my eyes, just over my shoulder, I could see Chad chewing his fingers, even as the sound of his tapping feet punctuated the otherwise silent space. "Could you stop that?" I said more harshly than I meant to. He gave a thoughtless apology and continued whittling down his fingernails. I returned my attention to searching for a way out. I was beginning to regret why I'd even bothered with the wall when I spotted something in the corner. A slit, probably designed to go unnoticed when looked at by unfamiliar eyes. The card didn't get far into the slit when the floor beneath our feet began dropping. It went on for a long while before coming to a quick stop. The wall behind us, opposite the one we made it through, slid open, forming a new pathway out of the elevator. The space in front of us was a vast one, shrouded in darkness, lit only by a faint, pulsating light in the distance. With cautious steps, we walked towards the light until we came to an even more open space than the one that came before. My hands wrapped around my torso to make up for the slight drop in the temperature in the room. This room, if it could be called one, as it seemed to span endlessly, continuing in the darkness beyond. The visible part of the room was covered in a slightly darker version of a texture reminiscent of the elevators. The room seemed to be demarcated into quadrants, with each quadrant bearing some class of machine or another. "What is this place?" I asked no one in particular.
"I don't know what it is, but we aren't in Kansas anymore," Chad said with a smile that spanned ear to ear.
I looked at him with a look that was a cross between exasperation and irritation. He seemed to have caught my meaning.
"I'm sorry. Always wanted to say that. It just seemed like the right thing to say,"
he said as he walked ahead of me, pulled out his camera, and began taking pictures of everything around us. "I thought you didn't want to come down here."
"I did it, but I can't let go of this. This would do numbers for my blog's readership."
Pharmacist. I shook my head and continued until we reached the center of the quadrants I mentioned earlier. In it stood a 9-foot space-black block. It had been the source of the pulsing light. It looked like a machine with all the circuitry, wires, and control knobs running along the face of the entire monolith. Chad was still taking pictures when I decided there was nothing to see. "We must leave now, Chad. Join the group before our absence is noticed." The only reply I got was the whining sound of his camera flash. I was back at the elevator when I looked back and saw 2 pulsating lights, the aboriginal red light and Chad's camera taking a picture of the former. I swiped the key twice before it registered and went back to drag him away from the monolith.
"Wait, I need a few more from different angles," he yelled.
I was still tugging at him when he tripped on something, causing us to fall. Our fall must have done something, because not a minute after we fell did the alarms begin whining. Shit. There was no way we were going to be caught here. I was pulling him when he tripped on something else and fell again. I helped him up and rushed to the elevator. Halfway to the elevator, a disembodied voice began talking through speakers above the room.
"Pod compromised."
Pod compromised. We got into the elevator. I waved the cart around and began our ascent, even as I muttered inaudible distressors. Beyond the blaring alarm and the seemingly disconnected voice from the PA, I heard it. I was still contemplating our situation when the elevator came to an abrupt stop, throwing us into the air and back to the floor. The elevator whine died down, even as the lights went off.
"Pod compromised. This is no need to panic. Begin evacuation to the southern part of the compound. Teams are on their way."
"We need to make it out of here before they find us," I said as I brought my phone and put on the torch.
"We should just sit tight and wait for them,"
Chad refuted. "How do you explain us being in an elevator that isn't supposed to exist?" I tried to keep control of my pitch.
"What do you suggest? I don't think swiping the card as you're doing will work."
Even though I gave him a murderous glare, I knew he was right. We'd have to make it out another way. I looked around, and I figured out our way out. After climbing through the escape hatch and through the door, Chad and I emerged on the floor labeled -6. My temporary disbelief that we were underground was undercut by the chaos that filled the halls. 3.
"The place really went to hell quickly,"
he said as I turned my head. I had to admit, he was right. The powers must have gone out, killing the elevator. After roaming through the 5th hallway, I heard it. It sounded like the screech from my apartment, but this time mixed with continuous, explosive bursts, as if something was climbing up from beneath at a rapid rate. The voice came over the PA again. This time, I could have sworn, if I listened very closely, there was something behind the monotonous delivery of its warning. It sounded like fear. "Protocol 52 in effect," she said, even as the climbing sound got louder and closer.
"What do you think is going on?"
"Let's go, Chad," I said as my eyes scanned for an exit. "We're in danger."
"You don't know that we're in harm's way," he replied.
"You don't know that we aren't either, so if it's all the same with you, let's move."
I shouted and began moving without checking to see if he was being followed. "They're shutting this place down," I started. "They're going to incinerate it along with us if we don't make it out in time." "How do you know that?" he asked. How did I know that? I didn't. I couldn't have. We only rounded the first corner when we came to a sudden stop. Chad's teeth began chattering, even as several beams were pointed at us. Was this the end? I couldn't hear the sound anymore. I spent almost an eternity peering into the looming darkness behind the light beams pointing at us. I lifted my phone's torch and saw the beam's source. My heart dropped with relief even as the following sound made it go back up. "What are you doing in this area?" one of them shouted as he pointed his gun at us. Trapped in the determination of his eyes, I muttered that we had gotten lost. "What was that?" he shouted, his voice a sharp contrast to my cluttered delivery. With hands still up, I repeated my words, louder this time. "Show me some identification," he said. I wrangled my ID card from my inner jacket pocket and pointed it at them. "Is that enough?" I asked. I didn't quite get the answer because, at that moment, a large burst of energy rocked the ground beneath our foot. The resonating screech found my unwilling ear, but this time broke the wall and caused something to come crashing down. That was no human, my mind blared even as I struggled to get back on my feet. "Head this way! You should see a staircase. It's the fastest way out of here. Take it," he shouted as he checked on his fellow soldiers. One had been crushed by falling debris. I was about to move closer when he turned around. "What are you still doing here? Run!" We did. We found the staircase the soldier had talked about, but one thing he neglected to mention was how much there was to it. But as it was better than being in the presence of whatever was behind us, we started climbing. We were on level -4 when another screech came through. Like the last time, it tore the walls out, but this time it cut off the path forward. We tried to move some of the debris, but it was unmoving. I could feel the floor beneath us start to get hotter. The incineration had begun. "We need to make it out of here," Chad said, as if he thought he was Moses, and stating an obvious fact would make the river of stone part. "What do we do?" He turned and asked when there wasn't any great memory. "I don't know. Let me think. What did the soldier say when he sent us on our way, when he ordered us to move?" Chad looked at me for a quick minute before replying. I don't know. He said to take the staircase." "Yes, that's what he said, but not quite," I replied as I tried to think about it through my spiking heartbeat. "He said head up to the staircase. It's the fastest way out of here." "I bet there's another way." "Yes, the elevator," Chad replied shamelessly. "Not the elevator. It has to be something else." "Why do we need to go anywhere? We could just stay here until everything is over. No fuss." "No fuss? Did you hear the announcement over the PA? Can't you feel the heat?" I asked, with half of my mind wondering if he wanted to die. "There is something loose in the building." "Our path off here is blocked, Aaron. What would you have us do?" "To the stairs on the other side," I ordered. I didn't tell him I was just taking a bet that a building of this size had more than one way to leave. My phone, just like the floor beneath us, was getting hotter. The air in the corridor now smelled like the onstage of burning flesh. Chad had thrown up when we saw the first mutilated body. That hadn't been the last time, either. We were walking through the corridor after sighting the man that had been cut into two when it happened. Another noise beset the silent corridor after the pulsating screech had passed. I wanted to run like Chad, but I couldn't. I remained rooted to the spot. The handless man ran down the corridor and fell in front of me, and he whispered something that caused my stomach to churn. "It's coming." I walked up with a head full of static hum and ears full of siren noise, and began walking slowly at first, but faster as the seconds dropped. I knew it was behind me. I ran until I came up to another staircase. Another scream sounded familiar. I walked up to level -3 until I couldn't anymore, as it had been closed off. Reminded by the silence that Chad was no longer here, I had to make it out, and it had to be through this vent. There was no other way. I scrambled it. Mid-crawl, I looked out of a hole on the right and saw the creature responsible for all the suffering. Beneath me, I saw a 10-foot-tall, bulky frame with slimy skin. I swallowed my scream and crawled forward slowly. Shit, shit, shit. I was almost out of the vent when I caught sight of one of its tails. There was a head, disconnected from its body, hanging on it. Chad. The sound that came from my lips was all it needed to know I was there. It turned and looked into my eyes. I was trapped again in the vent, and its eyes. There was something in it. Just like me, it didn't want to be here, too. Snapped out of my trance by the sudden noise, I doubled my crawling speed even as the screech half deafened me and its tentacles collapsed sections of the vent. I was done for. I had almost given up when I saw a hole. I didn't know where it went, but I jumped through it. I landed on the floor of a room filled with eyes all looking at me. There was an uproar of shouts as I tried to ease their fears. It was only when I raised my hands to do so that I had lost my right arm. The pain coursed through my body and came out as a scream. It might have been either my voice or theirs that drew its attention to the room, whatever it was. The creature tore through the wall, cutting everyone in half with slimy tentacles. This was a slaughter. I felt my body go limp as one of its tentacles wrapped around my neck and raised me to its eye level. As if it didn't like what it saw, it began squeezing. I could feel the life drain out of me when a pulsating light blasted through the wall. People. Humans. They pushed the black machine into the room. It began sucking the beast from the room, leaving me to fall to the ground. Everything went dark. And when I woke, I was here, in an asylum. Not crazy. I was never in the military. In this Paladin military unit where I saw people slaughtered. I was in the NASA building, and I wasn't forced out of bed 9 o'clock every morning to go to the dispensary to get meds. I know what I saw. NASA has a machine underneath it that has an alien trapped in it. Who knows for how long it has been in there. Hey, sci-fi horror fans. It's Thomas. You get the idea. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Also, if you'd like to become an official member of our channel, you can do so by clicking on the join button. Memberships start at only $5. Craving for another scary story? Click on that video on your screen, recommended only for you by YouTube. Until next time, and remember, stay cosmic.